Very kind words. We invented the word titbit, by the way. Yeah. And it's also a very great honour to be here at this place. I had the great honour of being invited by President Bush and Barbara Bush to have lunch with them at Kennebunkport about 8 years ago. And the lunch went on so long that it turned into dinner, and we went out to dinner at a crab restaurant, and so many people came up to clap him on the back and to shake his hand and everything like that. And when he came back after, literally pretty much everyone in the restaurant had congratulated him, he sat down and said, "I wish they'd all voted for me." Rectally, which you might have thought would have put you off brandy for life, but certainly didn't in Winston Churchill's case. He was nearly killed in a car crash, sorry, 2 car crashes, nearly killed in 3, and also 2 plane crashes. He was nearly drowned crossing Lake Geneva, swimming in Lake Geneva when his boat went away from him, and he was only just able to catch up with it. Nearly died in a house fire when the wing of the old Elizabethan house that he was staying in caught fire at 3 o'clock in the morning when he was fast asleep upstairs. And as you can see from this picture of him, the great Yusuf Karsh photograph of 1941, you can see that big scar down the centre of his forehead there, which came as a result of being knocked over by a car in 5th Avenue on 76th Street, because as an Englishman he looked in the wrong direction. And those, ladies and gentlemen, are only the times in peacetime that he nearly died. In wartime, he had, between the ages of 21 and 25, he took part in 4 campaigns on 3 continents. He had taken part in the last great cavalry charge of the British Empire at the Battle of Omdurman, where he killed 4 dervishes. He was, the following year, ambushed in an armoured train by the Boers in the South African War, and was then taken as a prisoner of war, and he escaped from the prisoner of war camp 2 months later and crossed 300 miles of enemy lines and managed to escape. On one occasion, he had to sleep down at the bottom of a deep mine shaft, and when his candle guttered out, he had rats crawling across his face. And he was also followed by a vulture for a day as well. In the First World War, he was a lieutenant colonel in charge of the 6th Battalion of the Royal Scots Fusiliers, and he crossed into no man's land no fewer than 30 times in the course of the 6 months in which he was in the trenches. And he got so close to the German trenches that he could actually hear them speaking. He could have stayed back in battalion headquarters, of course he could have, he was a lieutenant colonel, but he wanted to experience the danger of the troops under his command. And what this did, what the experience gave him of all these extraordinary close brushes with death, was to make him incredibly calm when the great crisis did come, when the crisis that threatened to destroy London and England and the Empire did come in 1940. He was so calm that he made jokes almost constantly, calming his entourage and the public and the House of Commons. There's a marvellous moment in one of the confidence motions in the House of Commons when theoretically his government could have fallen, when he was talking about the complete uselessness of the A-22 tank. He was being attacked for this, and he didn't for a moment deny that the A-22 tank was useless. And he said, when the teething troubles and the defects of the A-22 tank became apparent to all, it was appropriately rechristened the Churchill. And the key word there is appropriately, because Churchill perfectly understood about himself that he had terrible defects and terrible teething troubles himself. He had got so many things wrong in his life. He had got the gold standard wrong, he had got women's suffrage wrong, he had got the abdication crisis wrong. He had, there were any number of the black and tans in Ireland. He had made mistakes. As he said to his wife, as he wrote to his wife from the trenches, "I would have made nothing if I had not made mistakes." He was a politician who was able to learn from his mistakes. When one looks at the Dardanelles crisis of 1915, it was in essence a brilliant move, a brilliant idea, a genius idea. What he wanted to do as First Lord of the Admiralty was to try to get the Royal Navy through the Dardanelles Straits and to anchor it off Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, and by the sheer threat of having it there, to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the Central Powers, basically take Turkey out of the war, which, had it come off, would have been one of the great coups of military history. But of course it didn't. It didn't come off because of the implementation of the attack and the timing of the attack by the Admiral on the spot. Churchill was still back in London, of course. And the Allies lost 6 ships on the 18th of March 1915. And then instead of pulling back and calling the whole thing off, Churchill was a key figure, not the only person, but the key figure in ensuring that the attack was doubled down, and they then assaulted the Gallipoli Peninsula on the European side of the Straits, and the fighting got. When you go there, you look up and you can see the Turkish gun emplacements and the sheer impossibility of getting from the beaches into the inland. And ultimately, over the next 8 months of fighting, every bit as bad the fighting as on the Western Front, which of course was the reason that they were the exact thing they were trying to avoid. It led to the killing or wounding of 147,000 Allied troops. And this was held against him, as you can imagine, for decades afterwards. He was still, in the early 1930s, he still had people shouting, "What about the Dardanelles?" at him at public speeches that he gave. But he learnt from it. He was a politician who learnt from his mistakes. He learnt, in this case, never to overrule the chiefs of staff. In the Second World War, he didn't once overrule the chiefs of staff when all 3 of the chiefs of staff opposed him, and which they very often did over attacks to do with northern Sumatra or northern Norway. When they said no, he backed down. The chief of the Imperial General Staff, Sir Alan Brooke, Field Marshal Lord Alan Brooke, as he became, would sit across the cabinet table in the Defence Committee meetings, breaking pencils in half, saying, "No, I disagree with you, Prime Minister." Crack. It must be very off-putting to have a 6'4" flinty Ulsterman sitting opposite you, telling you how he disagrees with you. And Churchill would try everything to persuade them. But if he failed, he didn't push it to the furthest limit, which he constitutionally could have because he was Minister of Defence as well as Prime Minister. So here is a politician, therefore, who can learn from his mistakes. I'm often asked why, if there are, as there are, sadly, 1,009 biographies of Winston Churchill, why I should be so hubristic as to impose a 1,010th on the public. The answer is that in the last 10 years, there has been a cornucopia of new sources about Churchill that has become available, that scholars can access. I was very fortunate that Her Majesty the Queen allowed me to be the first Churchill biographer to use her father's diaries, to be able to see her father's diaries. And King George VI met Winston Churchill every Tuesday of the Second World War. And Churchill trusted the king. They met at lunch at Buckingham Palace, and they served themselves from the sideboard, excuse me, because nobody else could be present, because Churchill trusted the king with all of the great secrets of the Second World War. He told him about the nuclear secret. He told him about the Enigma decrypts. He told him which countries were going to be attacked, when and under what circumstances. He told him which ministers and which generals were going to be hired and fired. And there was no reason particularly why they should get on so well. Actually, Churchill had told, had really felt that the king lacked judgment because of his great support for Neville Chamberlain and the policy of appeasement. Equally, the king thought that Churchill lacked judgment because of his support for King Edward VIII during the abdication crisis, his elder brother. And he told the Canadian Prime Minister, William Mackenzie King, that he would only ever appoint Winston Churchill Prime Minister in the case of a world war. Which has its own irony, needless to say. And yet, very quickly, they became friends, proper friends. The word friends appears in the king's diaries. And he became the only one of the king's 4 prime ministers that he referred to by his Christian name. And the wonderful thing, for me at least, was that after each of these meetings, the king wrote down everything that Churchill said. So we know now everything that Churchill was thinking. New jokes, new aperçus, new quotations every Tuesday of the Second World War. We also have had 41 sets of papers that have been deposited at Churchill College Archives in Cambridge University from people around Churchill, working with Churchill since the last major biography of him, including Mary Soames, Winston Churchill's daughter. We've got the verbatim accounts of the war cabinets, which I discovered 6 years ago, which I managed to find, and so we now know everything that was actually said in each of the war cabinet meetings, word for word. And we have the diaries of Ivan Maisky, the Soviet ambassador, 1932 to 43, who saw an awful lot of Churchill, especially in the period of the Nazi Soviet, but just before the Nazi-Soviet pact. I was also very fortunate that the Churchill family allowed me to be to have exclusive access to Pamela Harriman's love letters. And Pamela Harriman, who was, of course, married to Randolph Churchill during the Second World War and had a baby by him, led a very active romantic life in the Second World War, as well as having an affair, of course, with her future husband, Averell Harriman, the FDR's envoy. She also had affairs with Ed Murrow, the great journalist, and Jock Whitney, and General Kenneth Anderson, and Marshal of the Air Force, Sir Charles Portal, and someone we just know of as Jerry. Although I was given exclusive access to her papers, nobody had exclusive access to her. And what we get, ladies and gentlemen, from all these new sources is the sense of Churchill as being an extraordinarily emotional man, someone driven by his passions. He was not the buttoned-up Victorian aristocrat of the late 19th century. He was somebody who wore his heart on his sleeve. He burst into tears on some 50 occasions in public during the Second World War. These weren't tears of self-pity ever. They were tears of defiance very often. But they were, one wonders, I sometimes think what would happen if Theresa May were to burst, she's got every right to, I hasten to add, but burst into tears in public. But people understood that he was not this Victorian aristocrat, although of course he was by birth, but nonetheless, he was actually a throwback to an earlier era. He was a romantic Regency figure, somebody who was capable of wearing his heart on his sleeve. He was not a depressive. He, for many years now, for half a century, we have believed, most people at least have believed, that Winston Churchill, because he mentioned black dog, had a form of chemical imbalance, depression. But actually, he only mentioned black dog once in his life, in a letter in 1911 to his wife Clementine, in which he said that he, at a time, by the way, that black dog was used as an expression by Edwardian matrons to explain the bad behavior of their children. He got depressed. Undoubtedly, he got depressed. He got depressed at the time of the fall of Singapore in February 1942 and the fall of Tobruk in June 1942, and of course during the Dardanelles campaign that I mentioned earlier. But those were moments when anyone would have got depressed, any sentient being would have got depressed. What he didn't he didn't suddenly get depressed. He could chair, as he did, over 1,000 meetings of the Defence Committee of the War Cabinet until 3 o'clock in the morning at any time of day or night. I don't believe, therefore, and a lot of recent medical opinion agrees with me, that he was either a depressive or manic depressive, or let alone, as I've seen in some biographies, bipolar. Neither was he an alcoholic. He did drink an enormous amount, there's absolutely no doubt about that, but he had an iron constitution for alcohol. He would drink one or two glasses of champagne before lunch, and 1 or 2 glasses of white wine in the first course at lunch, and 1 or 2 glasses of red wine in the main course, and then he would have 1 or 2 glasses of brandy. And then much the same for dinner. And yet, in the whole Second World War, the 2,194 days of the Second World War, there is only one day, 7th of March 1944, when he was drunk, and the people around him recognised that he was drunk, and on that occasion they decided, the meeting went on till 3 o'clock in the morning, and what they decided to do was to hold the same meeting the next morning, pretending that the last one hadn't happened. And it worked very well. So there's no actual occasion on which a decision was made as a result of the Prime Minister being drunk. In fact, one of his friends, C.P. Scott, the journalist, said that Winston Churchill couldn't have been an alcoholic because no alcoholic could have drunk that much. He had a pretty terrible upbringing, owing to the fact that his brilliant, mercurial, disdainful, aloof father, Lord Randolph Churchill, who was a great Victorian Prime Minister, Chancellor of the Exchequer, and a very successful politician, never for a moment spotted any brilliance, anything special in his son, Winston. And some of the most painful letters in this book are the incredibly cruel letters that Lord Randolph wrote to Winston. He took no notice of him. Even when he was making a speech 2 miles away from Winston's prep school, he didn't bother to go and visit him. In fact, the only time he did visit him was when he was nearly dying at the age of 11 from pneumonia. His mother, Jenny Jerome, went totally against what one would expect of American motherhood, in that she showed absolutely no interest in her son at all, at least until he was 20 and became a signatory on her trust fund. She, in the first 6 months of 1884, when Winston was 9 years old, only saw him for 6.5 hours of those 6 months. And he wrote of her in his autobiography, My Early Life, that she shone for me like the evening star, brilliant but at a distance. And and with regard to his father, although it would have been perfectly understandable if he had been antithetical towards his father, instead he seemed to have loved his father all the more. He wrote his father's biography, 2 volumes, over 1,000 pages. He sought out his father's friends. He had he called his son Randolph after his father. He adopted his father's political stance, the Tory Democrat stance of Benjamin Disraeli, adopted his father's speaking stance, and also adopted his father's racing colours when finally, having been broke all his life, when finally he got into the black in his early 70s, Winston Churchill did the classically romantic Regency thing, aristocratic thing, of buying the first of 37 racehorses. But he was, and then in 1947, he believed, he wrote a short story about meeting his father's ghost. And on that occasion, he never let on to his father's ghost that he had been instrumental in helping win the Second World War. And so when his father's ghost disappeared, and it was written in 1947, and he said it was based on a true thing that had happened to him. When in 1947 he had met his father's ghost, when the ghost disappeared, he actually disappeared thinking that Winston Churchill was just a successful painter and not a successful politician or statesman. Why is it, all the way through the 4 years that I've been writing this, and of course this book, and this is the 5th book that I've written with Churchill in the title or the subtitle, and so over the last 30 years, including hundreds of reviews and so on, I wondered, and I kept wondering, why it was that Churchill managed to be the first major British politician, and in many ways the only major British politician for 10 years to spot the danger, the threat posed by Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. How can that be? And I think it comes down to 3 things. The first is that he was a Philo-Semite. He liked Jews. He had grown up with Jews. His father had liked Jews. He enjoyed spending time with them, and he was a Zionist, of course, who supported the Balfour Declaration, and he therefore had an early warning system when it came to Hitler and the Nazis that was not vouchsafed to many of the conservatives of his age and class and background, sitting on the same benches as him, many of whom were anti-Semitic. The second thing was that he was a historian. One of the reasons that I'm proud to be an historian is that Winston Churchill was one. He was able to put Adolf Hitler in the long panoply of people who tried to gain hegemony over the European continent. He saw him, therefore, as part of that continuum which involved 400 years before Philip II of Spain and the Spanish Armada, Louis XIV and the War of Spanish Succession, which of course his own great ancestor, the first Duke of Marlborough, was instrumental in stymieing. Then Napoleon, who he admired, very much admired for his sense of destiny and his ambition and his talent, but nonetheless appreciated was a threat to the European balance of power. And then the Kaiser, who he had fought against himself, and then Adolf Hitler as part of this long continuum. And another reason was that he saw in the Nazis the same sense of fanaticism that he had himself fought against when he was in his 20s in the Sudan and the Northwest frontier. In that case, of course, it was Islamic fundamentalist terrorism and fanaticism, and but with the Nazis, it was the political rather than the religious equivalent. but he saw it in a way that none of the other prime ministers of the 1930s, not Ramsay MacDonald, not Stanley Baldwin, not Neville Chamberlain, because none of them had come anywhere near seeing that kind of fanaticism in their own lives. And as well, therefore, as having the capacity to learn from his mistakes and to have the great foresight to spot Hitler and the Nazis for what they really were. And by the way, of course, that was true before the First World War as well, with Prussian militarism and Wilhelmine Germany, but also, of course, after the Second World War, when he made his great Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri in March 1946 and warned the world about Stalin and Soviet imperialism in Eastern Europe. So as well as this capacity for foresight and this capacity to learn from his mistakes and extraordinary physical courage and great moral courage as well, because he was shouted down in the House of Commons on one occasion. The Conservative Party tried to take away his seat in the 1930s. He was lambasted, he was ridiculed, he was attacked as a warmonger, and yet none of these things made him change his message about Hitler and the Nazis. This is a man, ladies and gentlemen, who never employed a spin doctor, never employed a speechwriter, never took very much notice of opinion polls, never had any kind of focus groups. When he spoke to you, you knew that it was Winston Churchill himself who was speaking. And so you have all of this, and one other element was desperately needed too, and that, of course, was eloquence, was the capacity, the ability to make people listen to you even though they didn't want to, and even though they disagreed with you. And Winston Churchill, through his reading of Gibbon and Macaulay, and he was a great Shakespeare aficionado, and his writing of 37 books and 890 articles. He was at one point the best paid war correspondent in the world. The reason that he had to do this, of course, was he was broke all the time. But nonetheless, that's as good a reason as any, because he was able, therefore, to formulate these phrases and create these wonderful speeches that the phrases from which will live as long as our tongue survives. He was once asked by his private secretary how he actually managed to, what the tricks of the trade were, really, what his technique was for making these great speeches that created such a sense of inspiration during the Second World War that was so good at boosting morale. And he said that there were four things that one needed. The first was keep sentences short. Very important. What he called that English, that noble thing, the English sentence, needed to be kept short. It needed to be totally clear so everybody understood exactly what each sentence was doing. Words in the sentences needed to be short as well, and if possible, use Old English, use Anglo-Saxon, use phrases and words that would immediately be understandable to the English-speaking peoples, because they themselves have been using those same words for 1,000 years. And so when you look at the peroration of his "We Shall Fight on the Beaches" speech of June 1940, that famous speech in which he talks about fighting, about when the Germans invade, which was expected at any time, at any minute, and continued to be expected for an entire year. He said that we were going to fight on the beaches, but also on the landing grounds and in the hills and in the streets, and fight with growing confidence in the air. And of course, that final line about "we shall never surrender." If you look at that paragraph of 141 words, there are all but two of them are actually to be found in Old English. The only exceptions being Latin, the word confidence, which comes from the Latin, and surrender, which comes from the French. you've asked an Englishman to speak here. So to conclude, we have, therefore, a man who makes mistakes, many, many mistakes, but learns from them, and knows, of course, that these great reversals in fortune are really epicentral to understanding who he is. Somebody who has a sense of destiny, a driving sense of destiny, somebody who is physically extraordinarily courageous. He travelled 110,000 miles outside the United Kingdom during the Second World War. He, in planes that were unpressurized at the age of 70, very often within the radius of the Luftwaffe. On one occasion, coming back from here, from America, his plane was struck by lightning. If the instrumentation had gone down, that would have been it. And he continued this bravery through the Second World War. He went up onto the Air Ministry roof during the Blitz, for example. He was as physically courageous as he was morally courageous. He also had this foresight, and he also had this eloquence. And so, as a result, you have the situation, ladies and gentlemen, in which he was able to go one stage further, one very important stage further, from what he had himself prescribed for himself as a 16-year-old schoolboy, because he did not just manage to save London and save England, but he also managed to save civilization itself. Thank you very much indeed.
Am I on? Well, the only thing David asked me to do other than make remarks was to ask people to do cards to fill them out, which I didn't do.
Yeah.
But as you can see, we have a lot of folks that have come as our 54th, so there was no problem in filling out. Would you like to sit or stand?
I'll stand, actually.
Well, then I'll stand also.
Okay.
So here's what we'll do. I've got four.
Unless you want to sit.
No, sir.
Okay,
I'm fine.
Okay.
Because I've got trousers that are high water. and if they ride up, they'll look like this.
Okay, let's sit then.
So, do you have high water trousers?
I don't know. I don't know what you're talking about.
So I've got 4 or 5 questions, and then I'm going to have a quick round, and then I've got one final question. So
okay.
The first question is, and as you've written on Napoleon and Churchill and others, what has been the most fascinating character? And let's set it this way. We are having a dinner next week at the Savoy, and Mr. Churchill and Napoleon has accepted our dinner invitation. What 2 or 3 other people do we like to have around the table that you've researched that have come out of all this?
Do you know, I think it would be quite difficult to get a word in edgeways with those two. I would do anything to meet Winston Churchill. If I only had 10 minutes, it would be wonderful. I'd give my little finger right now. If you had a small guillotine, John, to chop it off, I'd be perfectly happy in order to meet him.
We can arrange that at the vet school.
But it's one of the things about being a writer. You always fall. You either wind up loving or hating the person that you're spending 4 years with, or in my case with Napoleon. Actually, I spent 7 years, which is actually longer than Napoleon spent on St. Helena and Elba put together. And so it's usually the person, whoever you are writing about at the time. But with Churchill, he's always been, ever since I was 4 years old, and I was under the impression that my extremely fat cigar-smoking grandfather was Winston Churchill, and came as a terrible shock when I was about 7 and realised that he wasn't.
Great. Have you been to St. Helena?
Yes. Yes, it's a very weird place.
That's the end of the world, or you can see it from there, correct?
Yes, it totally is. It's a tiny speck, 8 miles by 10 miles, bang in the middle of the ocean, Atlantic Ocean, where we put Napoleon for the last 6 years of his life. And in my day, you can now fly there, but in my day it took 6 days to get there by boat. And unfortunately, the British being the British, on the Royal Mail packet ship, you had to sit next to the same person at every meal that you were placed next to on the first day. And in my case, it was a Swiss railway engineer. I got through everything I know about Swiss railways in about the first 5 minutes, and the next 6 days were purgatory.
This is a great question, and this is one that I wrestle with and that all historians do. How do you go about creating the right relationships to gain access to such exclusive and unique historical papers and documents, and especially since, as these are coming out, there must be others that are seeking to gain access to those. So is there a trait or something for budding historians that they need to think about?
I think it's important to, with regard to, say, for example, the Royal Archives, that I was fortunate enough to be the first Churchill historian to use these papers. And they're kept at the top of the Round Tower in Windsor Castle. It's quite a slog to walk up there. And what you have to do is, I think, establish a reputation for not being unfair. So I would say to the young historians, with your first few books, ensure that people can trust that you're going to be using your judgment in a decent and honourable way, and that way you're much more likely to be trusted with something extraordinary. And
so your writing style, what techniques or technologies and methods do you use? Are you writing at midnight in your pajamas, or do you?
Yeah, my wife complains about this all the time. I have my own way of doing this. I wrote this that book, which is 550,000 words long, in 100 days. So 5,500 words a day, and I did this by waking up at 4 o'clock in the morning, starting work around 4:15, 4:30, and then working through the early morning when nobody calls you. It's wonderful. It's great. And then in the afternoon, I would have a Churchillian nap for 45 minutes. And then when I started flagging in the later in the afternoon, I would drink a rather disgusting drink called Red Bull, which
Red Bull.
You have it here, do you? Red
That's
Bull?
The national drink of Texas.
Oh, I'm terribly sorry if it's the national drink of Texas. How
we
embarrassing!
Have Red Bull here.
And nonetheless, what it does is it keeps you like this the whole through until such time as you need to go to bed, and you get by doing that you get a huge number of hours that you work. My wife tells me, I'm not sure I remember or believe this, that in chapter 10 of the book, which is a very important, the Dardanelles chapter, which is the one that you really have to concentrate on and stay concentrating the whole way through, she says that I stayed in my dressing gown and slippers for 3 days. I so hope that's not true.
Do you think Mr. Churchill would like Red Bull? Or would he have, or would, with his metabolism, would he have needed it?
Well, what I can assure you is that I didn't drink 2 glasses of brandy every lunchtime.
Okay. This is a current question, and we have one more lengthy question. Then I've got a fast round of about 4 questions, and then our final question. Okay. This is a very interesting question. Wow. That what do you think Mr. Churchill's approach would be today to dealing with the current environment in the UK as concerns Brexit?
That's a very interesting question. The fact was that, of course, he was one of the founders of the European movement. In his great speeches at Strasbourg and The Hague and Zurich, he said that he came up with the concept of Europe Unite, because he never wanted, as he put it, Teuton to fight Gaul. Too many of his friends had died in both of the world wars for that. However, when you look more carefully at his exact phrasing, he at no stage suggests that the United Kingdom should be a member of the European, what was then the European Community. And when he became Prime Minister between 1951 and 1955, he actually prevented, which was only 2 years before the Treaty of Rome created the European community. He actually prevented the British getting involved in any of the transnational bodies that were being set up, like the European Union, the European Army, or the Iron and Steel Trades confederations. So it strikes me that that Churchill would not have wanted to have joined the European Union. However, his daughter, Mary Soames, always said to me, you should never assume that you know what Papa would have done. And of course, the referendum was half a century after his death.
All right, now just a fast round of questions. Number one, great question here. What is your favorite Winston Churchill quote?
Oh, golly.
Yeah, oh, golly.
Well, they're all, actually, it's usually gags. At any particular time, I enjoy Churchill jokes, and of which there are several hundred in this book, because he did make jokes all the time. He was so tremendously funny. And I'll probably tell one of his jokes at the end of this before we say goodbye. But actually, the quotation that I love most is his one about history that he gave in Westminster Abbey at Neville Chamberlain's funeral. And if anyone's got a book that I could borrow, I'd just like to look it up, because I think I know which page it's on. Thank you very much.
You're really an author when you can open up a 900-page book to an unexpected question and find the quote.
No, but it's not necessarily right that I might well have got it wrong. Yeah, typically. Here we go. Page 617. So he's giving a speech at Neville Chamberlain's funeral, and it's a freezing cold day. They've taken down all the stained glass because they knew that German bombs could have otherwise destroyed this beautiful medieval stained glass, and they've put it and they've taken it away out of London, and so they've boarded up Westminster Abbey, and you can imagine on the 12th of November it's absolutely freezing cold, and everyone's wearing their overcoats, and Churchill comes up to give a speech, and it's about how Chamberlain might have been wrong about Munich and about appeasement, but nonetheless you can't see into the future, and he then talks about history and his philosophy of history, and he says this: "History with its flickering lamp stumbles along the trail of the past, trying to reconstruct its scenes, to revive its echoes, and kindle with pale gleams the passion of former days. What is the worth of all this? The only guide to a man is his conscience. The only shield to his memory is the rectitude and sincerity of his actions. It is very imprudent to walk through life without this shield, because we are so often mocked by the failure of our hopes and the upsetting of our calculations. But with this shield, however the fates may play, we march always in the ranks of honor."
Wow. That's hard to follow. But what I do have two more quick questions.
Okay. And I've got a joke at the end.
Good. Well, you will have your joke time. Do you see yourself writing about any figures in American history? Those of us in the colonies in the north and the republic down south.
My next book is going to be a biography of your last king, King George III.
Our last king. Our late last king.
Your late last king, exactly. I'm going to try to explain to you something that you might not agree with or want to hear, but nevertheless is true, which is that he was not the tyrant that Thomas Jefferson and Tom Paine made him out to be. He was in fact a highly enlightened, intelligent, charming, good-natured man. And he made a terrible mistake, needless to say, with the way that he treated you lot. But nonetheless, I want you to reappraise him and to have another look at him, and I'm going to ask possibly to come back in 2022 to try and persuade you.
That would be great. One more thing, we had a couple of these questions. There's been a couple of recent movies on Mr. Churchill.
Yes.
And some feel that they're good, some are fascinated by them.
Yeah.
And with the new information that's been brought to light in your book, do you think there's even a much more comprehensive movie or documentary that could be done?
Well,
I thought about that as I was reading the book, especially the World War I section. Is this he flies in 1914 and 15? He has 2 crashes. Well, that's 10 years after the Wright brothers. These planes are baling wire, and here he is flying, and he takes flying lessons. Correct?
That's right. And
so,
as you say, he crashes.
And so, on the movie scene, what do you see, and what's your?
Well, I really enjoyed Darkest Hour, the Gary Oldman movie, which I thought was great. It was pro-Churchill, which is very nice and slightly unusual, actually, at the moment, to see a movie that's pro-Churchill. I thought that what Gary Oldman did with his prosthetics and the smile on his face and the twinkle in his eye caught Churchill absolutely brilliantly. One of the top 3, I would say, films which actually show you what Churchill was genuinely like. I, of course, thought that the subway scene was ludicrous, and it also undermined the essential point about Churchill, which is not that he went and asked people, a focus group, about whether or not we should continue to fight Hitler. It was his decision to continue to fight on against Hitler and not make peace with Hitler in 1940, which gave the rest of the British people the courage to continue. And so it undermined, I think, that original fact. But my wife will not go to any history movies with me anymore. She says I'm a dreadful pedant, and she instances the time in 2017 when I watched a truly awful movie called Churchill with Brian Cox in it, in which Churchill at one point goes down on his knees and hoping that D-Day is going to be a failure. And I took out a piece of paper and a pencil and wrote down 120 errors in the course of the 2 hours of the movie.
Well, apparently you won't be a consultant on that film.
No.
I guess I can say this, but earlier this evening, right before sunset, we walked out to the graveside of the president and Mrs. Bush and their daughter. I hope all of you take that time to do that, which brings me to the last question. What do you believe are some of the leadership traits that are shared by President George W. Bush and Mr. Churchill?
I think there are many, and also George H.W. Bush as well. I think there are many.
I meant George H.W. Bush.
Yes.
Okay.
I think all 3 of them,
okay.
Actually. There was a willingness to see in Saddam Hussein a truly evil man who desperately needed to be stopped and defeated and ultimately done away with. And he was somebody who was willing to use weapons on his own people that are not a million miles away from the kind of weapons that Hitler was able to use on the Jews. He was somebody who was a tyrant in the classic sense of old-fashioned tyranny, going back to ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and who therefore a upstanding and honourable people like the United States and their allies. I'm very proud that the United Kingdom took part in that great coalition as well. Needed to stop and defeat and eventually destroy. I think this might be the moment, though, to end with something a little bit more uplifting and funny. And so I want to tell you my favourite Churchill joke. And that is the moment that his private secretary came to him and said that their cook had been made pregnant as the result of a nocturnal assignation with a man in the street in Verona. And Winston Churchill immediately replied, "Obviously not one of the 2 gentlemen." Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
It's great fun.
Well,
are we going to go off now?
Andrew and John, thank you very, very much for an extraordinary evening. And I wanted everyone to know, some of you know that we sold out of Andrew's book this evening. It was a very, very popular item. However, we will obtain additional copies that we'll have in our museum store. And Andrew has signed book plates for you. So if you didn't get a book and want to drop by the museum store, we're always welcome in our museum store. Come by and we'll put a book plate with his signature in the book for you. Again, thank you very much. Delightful to be with you.